In the world of organized crime, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a word said in the wrong language at the right moment. Celestia Vale, 26 years old, worked double shifts at the Opal Room in New Orleans' French Quarter, $9,200 in debt. Sister Seraphina's Tulane tuition due in 14 days, invisible to everyone who mattered. Then she spoke 7 words in an extinct Sicilian dialect to a Mafia boss seconds from executing her manager. 7 words her grandmother Odessa taught her in a shotgun house kitchen in the lower 9th Ward 20 years ago. Dante Corvo controlled 4 Louisiana crime families and $800 million in operations across the Gulf Coast. His last translator died 3 weeks ago, throat-cut body found in the bayou. He needed someone fluent in the old tongue, someone nobody would suspect. What Celestia didn't know, the killer was still in Dante's inner circle, and the next peace summit would end in a bloodbath unless she could hear the lie buried inside a toast. This is the story of a waitress who saved a Mafia boss with grammar and became the most powerful woman nobody ever saw coming. The body floated face down in Bayou Sauvage at dawn, caught between cypress roots and morning fog. Isabeau Thibault had been beautiful once before someone opened her throat with a precision that suggested professional disinterest rather than rage. The NOPD detective standing on the muddy bank wore latex gloves and an expression suggesting he'd seen worse, though not recently. Dante Corvo arrived in a black Escalade that made no pretense of discretion. He stepped out into humidity that turned dress shirts translucent by noon, his charcoal suit somehow immune to the climate's assault. 34 years old and carved from the kind of certainty that doesn't require symmetry to be compelling. Dark hair swept back from a face that revealed nothing. It didn't choose to reveal. Tattoos began somewhere beneath his collar, their geography suggesting stories he'd never tell to anyone wearing a badge. The detective looked up from the body bag being zipped closed. "Mr. Corvo? Didn't expect you personally." Dante's eyes tracked the crime scene with the methodical attention of someone cataloging exits and angles of fire out of pure habit. "Isabeau worked for me. I owe her the respect of identification." "Worked for you doing what exactly?" "Translation services, corporate negotiations." The lie settled between them like morning mist, visible, inconsequential, mutually acknowledged, as the cost of doing business in a city where half the economy operated in the spaces between what was spoken and what was meant. The detective pulled back the bag's zipper just far enough. Isabeau's face had the gray pallor of meat left too long in water. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing with the particular emptiness that suggested she'd seen her killer coming and understood exactly what it meant. Dante nodded once. "That's her." "When'd you last see her alive?" 8 days ago. Monday. She completed a translation job, collected her fee, left my office at Chupatula Street at approximately 6:15 p.m. "And you didn't think to report her missing when she didn't show up for work?" "Isabeau was freelance. She came and went according to contract. I had no reason to expect her presence until our next scheduled engagement." The detective's pen scratched against his notebook with the particular rhythm of someone writing down information he already knew was useless. "This next engagement, when was it supposed to happen?" "Tomorrow. Private dinner. She was contracted to translate for visiting business associates." "Guess you'll need to find a replacement." Dante looked at the body bag being loaded into the coroner's van at the bayou, swallowing the morning in layers of green and shadow at the particular quality of sunlight that made even murder look picturesque in Louisiana. "Yes, I will." He turned back toward the Escalade. His consigliere, a compact man named Rafe with silver threading through his beard, materialized at his elbow with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent 30 years being exactly where he needed to be without drawing attention to the fact. "Find me another." Rafe's expression didn't change. The kind of siculou she spoke that's not exactly common anymore. Most of the old families, their kids grew up speaking English. The dialect's dying. "Then find me someone before it's dead. Summit is in 11 days. Without a translator who can hear what's actually being said beneath the words, we walk into that room blind. And if we can't find someone in time..." Dante opened the Escalade's door, the interior cool and dark, and offering temporary refuge from the morning's accusations. Then we don't walk in at all. The Opal Room occupied the corner of Bourbon and Conti like a duchess pretending not to notice the strip clubs on either side. White tablecloths, Edison bulbs strung through exposed brick, the kind of calculated rusticity that cost $200 a plate and attracted the type of clientele who appreciated discretion as much as they appreciated the Gulf oysters. Celestia moved through the dining room the way water moves through a space that doesn't realize it's flooding along the edges, following paths of least resistance, never arriving anywhere dramatically. She'd worked here 4 years, long enough to perfect the particular invisibility that high-end service required. Present when needed, forgotten immediately after. Her feet ached in the specific way that transcended pain and became simple atmospheric condition like humidity. She was aware of them, the way she was aware of her heartbeat, constant background requiring intervention only when it stopped. Table 7 needed water. She noted the level in the crystal glasses, the angle of conversation suggesting the couple was building toward an argument they'd been rehearsing since the appetizer course. The woman's jaw had tightened incrementally with each dish. The man had stopped making eye contact somewhere between the soup and the salad. Celestia refilled their glasses without acknowledging the tension. Invisible people don't comment on what they observe. Table 9 held a business dinner where power had quietly shifted from the man at the head to the woman on his left. She'd begun answering questions directed at him 3 courses ago. He hadn't noticed yet. His colleagues had. Table 12 was celebrating something they hadn't disclosed to the reservation system. The body language read as relief rather than joy. One of them had visited the bathroom 4 times before the entree arrived. Celestia catalogued the information without examining why. Her grandmother had called it listening with your eyes, a habit formed young in a kitchen where the old woman communicated more through silence than speech. The spreadsheet lived on her phone, checked between courses when her hands needed something to do besides shake. 31 rows. Serafina's tuition installment. October rent for the shotgun house they shared in the Marigny textbooks, utilities, the medical bills from their father's final month that insurance had declined to cover with bureaucratic politeness. A narrow column on the right labeled margin for error that had been functionally empty since August, $9,200. 14 days. The math hadn't improved since yesterday. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Serafina's name on the screen, followed by 3 words that landed like stones in standing water. I'm so sorry. Celestia stepped into the service corridor, the noise of the dining room compressing into white static behind the swinging door. She opened the attached image, an invoice from the Tulane bookstore. Advanced Architectural Theory Text Studio supplies the specific materials required for a senior thesis project that couldn't be substituted with cheaper alternatives. $473. The follow-up text arrived before Celestia could formulate a response. Professor says I can't start without them. I tried to find used copies. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Celestia's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She composed 3 different replies. The one that told Serafina not to apologize for needing an education, the one that lied about the money being fine, the one that admitted the margin for error had just become a margin for catastrophe and sent none of them. Instead, don't worry, I've got it covered. She returned the phone to her pocket and her face to the careful neutrality that made her forgettable. The dining room continued its symphony of silverware and subdued conversation. Nobody had noticed her absence. Nobody ever did. The floor manager appeared at her shoulder with the expression of a man who'd recently reconsidered his career trajectory. Celestia, Table 1. His voice carried the specific frequency of controlled panic, pitched low enough that the dining room wouldn't register alarm, but urgent enough that she understood this wasn't a request. What's wrong with Table 1? Nothing's wrong, just... He paused, recalibrating his approach. Private party. Very private. Don't look directly. Don't engage unless asked. If you're walking past, walk past normally. Don't adjust your route. Don't... Giovanni, what's at Table 1? He glanced toward the private corner of the Opal Room, usually reserved for politicians who needed plausible deniability, and executives conducting negotiations that benefited from candlelight and bourbon. 6 men. 5 of them look like they're professionally violent. The 6th looks like he's professionally in charge of the other 5. They just seated, haven't touched menus, haven't touched bread. The one in charge asked our sommelier for something I've never heard of, and Benedict speaks 4 languages. Celestia looked. The private corner held 6 men arranged with the particular geometry of people who'd trained themselves to never fully turn their backs to a room. 5 were large in the way that suggests a professional relationship with physical confrontation, wide through the shoulders, economical with movement eyes that catalogued exits and potential threats with the autonomy of breathing. The 6th man was precise rather than large. Dark suit that moved with him like it had been constructed specifically for his particular stillness. Charcoal fabric that caught light without reflecting it. He sat at the table's center with the contained attention of someone who didn't repeat himself, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to do either, because rooms arranged themselves around his presence, whether he asked them to or not. He had not touched his menu, had not touched his water, was looking at Benedict the sommelier with the focused patience of someone waiting for the room to catch up to a decision he'd already made. Benedict stood beside the table with a bottle of wine that cost more than Celestia made in a week, speaking in the careful Italian he'd learned at a hospitality school in Tuscany, offering alternatives and vintage recommendations with increasing desperation. The man in the charcoal suit said something. Celestia couldn't hear it from the service corridor, but she could see its effect. Benedict's face drained to the color of unproofed dough. His assistant Marco, who had a degree in linguistics from Loyola and could discuss wine in French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, opened his mouth and produced nothing resembling language. Giovanni's hand closed around Celestia's forearm. Walk past. Don't stop. Don't look. Just. She was already moving. Not because Giovanni had told her to, not because Table 1 needed water or bread or anything she was technically responsible for providing. She moved because something in the quality of silence radiating from that corner table had triggered recognition in a part of her brain that stored information from before she understood she was learning it. Summer kitchens, stone floors warm from afternoon sun, sauce simmering since morning. A woman stirring with the patience of someone who'd never once in her life been in a hurry. Nonna Odessa had not taught Celestia Sicalu Antico the way a language is taught. She'd simply spoken it constantly, fluently, without translation, and Celestia had absorbed it the way children absorb everything that surrounds them before they develop the ability to refuse. She hadn't spoken it aloud in 9 years. Not since the funeral. Not since standing in St. Louis Cemetery watching them lower Odessa into a tomb above ground because New Orleans didn't trust its dead to stay buried in soil that lived below sea level. The words came out perfectly. 7 words. A clarification, really. A restatement of what the man in the charcoal suit had requested, addressed back to him in his own tongue with the specific inflection of the interior highlands that Odessa had carried from her mother and her mother's mother before that. A question folded inside a confirmation the way the dialect preferred. You're asking for your father's wine, not a substitute. The room didn't go quiet. The room had already been quiet. What changed was the quality of the silence. It shifted from the held-breath quiet of people anticipating violence to something older and stranger and harder to name. The kind of silence that falls when something is recognized that had been given up as lost. The man's hand stopped moving. It had been traveling Celestia registered with delayed clinical clarity toward the interior of his jacket. The hand simply ceased its trajectory, paused mid-motion, suspended like a sentence interrupted by an unexpected word. His head turned toward her in the slow, deliberate way of someone who'd trained himself never to move quickly in surprise, because quick movement in surprise is how men in his position make irreversible errors. He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at Benedict. That had been the flat, pressurized gaze of someone rationing patience. This was different. This was the look of someone recalibrating entirely. His eyes moved across her face with focused, unhurried attention, reading a document he hadn't expected to find in a language he hadn't expected anyone else to know. Celestia stood still under the weight of it. She was good at being still. She waited. The man set down the glass he'd been holding. It was such a small movement, Crystal returning to tablecloth, but the room exhaled around it as though a pressure valve had been released. Benedict's shoulders dropped. One of the 5 large men shifted his weight. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to soften. The man in the charcoal suit did not look away from Celestia. He spoke 2 words to the men on either side of him, quiet and flat, and they stood without comment and moved to positions farther from the table, taking the geometry of the corner with them. Then he looked at Benedict and Marco and Giovanni, who had materialized at the scene's edge with the expression of someone deeply regretting every decision that had led him here. He said something in the dialect that Celestia's mind translated before she could stop it. "Leave us, all of you, now." Giovanni opened his mouth. Celestia watched him calculate the distance between professional obligation and self-preservation in approximately 1 second. He chose correctly. They retreated. Benedict first, then Marco, then Giovanni, with a single backward glance at Celestia that contained an entire conversation she didn't have time for. The man gestured to the chair across from him. It wasn't an invitation. It was an indication the way you indicate a fact. The chair existed. She would sit in it. These were simply the next events. Celestia looked at the chair and noticed what she'd registered from across the room without fully processing. It was the only place setting at the table that hadn't been touched. No bread plate disturbed, no water glass lifted, napkin still folded in its original architecture, set for someone who had never arrived or who was always meant to remain absent. A kept space. She sat down. The man poured her water without asking. Then he looked at her across the table with that same recalibrating attention and began in Sicily Antico to ask her questions. Not rudely. That surprised her. She'd expected interrogation in the aggressive sense, the rapid-fire pressure of someone trying to catch her in inconsistency. Instead, his questions came with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned that information obtained under pressure is unreliable and that the more useful technique is simply to create a space where truth finds it easier to enter than lies. He asked where she'd learned the dialect. She told him about Odessa, the shotgun house in the lower ninth. The summers spent in that kitchen while her parents worked double shifts at the port. How the old woman had spoken Sicily constantly, stubbornly, as though Italian and English were languages for people who'd forgotten who they were. He asked the address of the house. She told him. Something shifted fractionally in his expression, not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement, like a door opening inward by a single degree. He asked if anyone else at the restaurant spoke it. She said no. He accepted this without visible reaction. He asked what other languages she carried. She listed them: English, functional Italian from a community college course she'd abandoned when the tuition became untenable, enough French to navigate the quarter's tourist traffic, the dialect. He absorbed each one the way someone adds figures to a column. Then he asked something she hadn't anticipated. He asked about her sister. Celestia went still in the particular way she'd perfected over 4 years of staying invisible in rooms that required it. She had not mentioned Serafina, had not mentioned anything personal beyond Odessa and the house, had spoken perhaps 40 words total since sitting down. She asked in the dialect how he knew. He almost smiled. A woman who takes double shifts on a Thursday and still watches every table like it owes her something is not working for herself. Celestia looked at him across the white tablecloth, across the untouched place setting, across the particular silence of a language most of the world had already agreed to forget. Silence, Odessa had taught her, is not absence. At the right moment it becomes the most complete form of answer available. The man nodded slowly as though she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He reached for the wine bottle Benedict had abandoned, poured 2 glasses with the unconscious precision of someone who'd been pouring wine at tables like this since before he was old enough to drink it legally. He told her his name, Dante Corvo. The restaurant outside their corner was called the Opal Room, but the name people whispered in certain circles was different. He controlled interests across the Gulf Coast, shipping, construction, waste management, the industries that operated in the gray spaces between legal commerce and what the federal government preferred not to acknowledge as long as taxes got paid and bodies stayed buried. He told her what he was doing in New Orleans. 3 families from the interior parishes, 2 organizations from Houston, a week of meetings at locations she'd be informed of each morning. A restructuring of certain arrangements that had been generating friction. He used the word deliberately clinically for the better part of 3 years. The friction had recently produced consequences. 2 men in Baton Rouge, 1 in Biloxi. The kind of consequences that attracted federal attention and disrupted the ordinary commerce of everyone involved, which was bad for business. Bad for everyone's business. The problem, he explained, was language, not Italian. Everyone at these tables spoke Italian. Some spoke English. The problem was the layer beneath, the dialect negotiations, the coded register that certain of the older men dropped into when stakes became real, when they stopped performing and started meaning. His interpreter had suffered a sudden and specific unavailability 3 weeks ago. He said this without elaboration. Celestia did not ask for any. What he needed for 11 days was someone who could sit in a room and hear what was actually being said beneath what was being said. Someone whose presence would not register as threat. Someone the room would not remember. The figure he named solved every row on the spreadsheet with enough remaining to build the margin for error back to something that deserved the name. $17,000. Celestia's hands were flat on the tablecloth. The gesture meant something in the dialect, something about commitment and the space between decision and action. Dante looked at her hands with the recognition of someone who knew exactly what the gesture meant and what it did not mean yet. He refilled her water. Waited. The reasonable part of Celestia's mind, the part that had kept her alive and employed and functional for 26 years, began composing objections. The obvious ones about danger and legality, and the kind of people who needed translators for the words they didn't want anyone else to understand. The practical ones about Serafina and the house and what happened if she disappeared the way Isabeau Thibault had disappeared, throat-cut and floating in water that didn't care about intentions. But beneath the reasonable objections was something older. A memory of Odessa stirring sauce in afternoon light, speaking the old tongue with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted its value. The way she'd looked at Celestia over the steam dark eyes, sharp and unapologetic, saying in Siculou, "The language is a key to doors people think are locked forever. You think you're learning words for cooking. You're learning how to hear what liars can't hide." Celestia had been 8, had not understood, had absorbed it anyway, the way children absorb everything. She understood now. She looked at Dante Corvo across the table. This man, whose last translator had been murdered, whose world operated according to rules that didn't appear in any community college textbook, who had somehow found her in a city of 300,000 people because her grandmother had once done exactly what he was asking her to do. "When do we start?" Dante's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested satisfaction. "Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Arnaud's restaurant private room. Wear something you wouldn't wear to wait tables. You're not staff anymore." He stood. The 5 men materialized from their positions around the room with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd been waiting for exactly this signal. One of them placed an envelope on the table in front of Celestia. "First installment, 5,000. Remaining 12 on completion if the summit ends without additional friction." Celestia looked at the envelope. Did not touch it yet. The weight of what she'd just agreed to was settling into her bones with the slow certainty of water finding its level. Dante paused at the edge of the corner, turned back. "One more thing. The woman who had this job before you, Isabeau, she was good, fluent, careful. She understood the stakes and played by the rules." He let the sentence hang there unfinished, the way you leave certain truths incomplete because their implications are more effective than their conclusions. Celestia met his eyes. "What happened to her?" She heard something she wasn't supposed to hear, and she made the mistake of thinking she could use it. The 5 men followed Dante toward the exit. The restaurant continued its ordinary business around them, utterly unaware that anything had shifted. Giovanni would be waiting in the service corridor with questions Celestia wouldn't answer. Benedict would be cataloging wine bottles with shaking hands. The couple at table 7 would finish their argument. The woman at table 9 would consolidate her power. The celebration at table 12 would conclude with relief that looked nothing like joy. And Celestia would go home to the shotgun house in the Marini with $5,000 in an envelope and the growing certainty that she'd just stepped through a door that didn't open from the other side. She took the tram because she always took the tram, and she was not yet ready to be a person who did otherwise. The city moved past the windows in its nighttime configuration restaurants, emptying the quarter, settling into its nocturnal economy of desires that didn't require daylight. Celestia watched without seeing her hands in her lap, aware of them in a way she hadn't been before, as though the gesture at the table had left some residue of significance that hadn't finished meaning something yet. The envelope rested in her bag. She had not opened it. Did not need to. Dante Corvo was not the kind of man who shorted payment or miscounted bills. $5,000. 14% of her debt solved. The rest contingent on her ability to survive the next 11 days, doing work that had gotten the last woman killed. The house on Dauphine Street had been in Odessa's family since Reconstruction. Shotgun-style rooms arranged in a line from front to back, designed so you could fire a weapon through the front door and the bullet would exit the rear without hitting walls. Celestia had never been certain if this architectural feature was defensive practicality or metaphorical warning. She climbed the steps to the narrow porch. Inside, the silence held her particular shape, the accumulated texture of 4 years living alone since Serafina had left for Tulane. The tuition notice sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it that morning, face down, as though not looking at the numbers would make them less real. She turned it over. $9,200. Less $5,000 now. The math was improving. Above the radiator, Odessa's photograph lived between a clay dish and a paperback Celestia had never finished. Summer photograph taken in the kitchen doorway of the lower 9th house before Katrina had rewritten the neighborhood's population. Odessa squinting into afternoon light with the expression of a woman who found the sun personally presumptuous. She was not smiling exactly, she was doing something more specific. Celestia had spent years trying to name it, and had arrived finally at the closest available word, certain. Odessa looked certain in this photograph, certain of the doorway of the light of herself standing in it. Celestia set the photograph down. Did not call Serafina. Had composed 3 versions of that conversation on the tram, the one where she asked for advice, the one where she described what had happened and let her sister's reaction tell her something, the one where she said nothing about the evening and asked instead about the architecture coursework. She made none of them. Serafina would worry which was the one outcome the spreadsheet had never accounted for, and the one Celestia consistently refused to produce. She went to bed. Did not sleep immediately. When she did not dream, or if she did not remember which amounted to the same thing. Morning arrived with the particular quality of Gulf Coast light that made even ordinary decisions feel weighted with consequence. Celestia stood in her kitchen with coffee, looking at the brown apron on its hook by the door. The opal room apron canvas worn soft from 4 years of double shifts. A small burn mark near the hem from a candle incident at table 5 last February. She left it on the hook, dressed differently than she would have for a shift. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but with the quiet intention of someone who understands that what you wear into a room is the first thing the room knows about you. She walked the 14 blocks to Arnaud's restaurant because the morning was clear and she needed the time to prepare for whatever came next. The French Quarter woke slowly around her shopkeepers hosing down sidewalks, delivery trucks blocking streets with the casual arrogance of vehicles that knew they'd be gone before traffic became relevant. Arnaud's occupied its corner of Bienville Street with the unself-conscious authority of an establishment that had been serving French Creole cuisine since 1918 and had no intention of apologizing for outlasting prohibition, the Depression, Katrina, or any other inconvenience history had attempted. A man waited at the entrance. Not Dante, one of the 5 from last night, the one with silver threading his beard, compact and economical, who'd positioned himself with clear sight lines to both the street and the restaurant's interior. Celestia Vale, she nodded. Rafe Dominici, Mr. Corvo's consigliere. This way. He led her through the main dining room, empty at this hour tables set for lunch service that wouldn't begin for another 90 minutes, and up a narrow staircase to the second floor, a private room with windows overlooking the street. Long table already occupied by 12 men in various configurations of expensive suits and carefully maintained neutrality. Dante sat 3 chairs from the table's center, not at the head, not claiming dominance through position, simply present with the same contained stillness she'd seen last night. He looked up as she entered, gestured to the chair beside him without interrupting the conversation happening in Italian across the table. Celestia sat. Rafe positioned himself near the door with the other security 5 men total now distributed around the room's perimeter with the practiced invisibility of furniture that happened to be armed and attentive. The conversation continued in Italian. Careful, formal the Italian of official occasions and men performing reasonableness for an audience. Discussing shipping routes and territory boundaries with the rhythm of ritual everyone present had performed before. Celestia tracked it with a fraction of her attention and gave the rest to the layer beneath. It began within 10 minutes. One of the northern men, broad, silver-haired, projecting the particular confidence of someone who'd never seriously considered that a room might not be his, leaned to confer with his associate in a coastal Calabrian subdialect. Just a phrase, a casual aside clearly considered private. Celestia's ear caught it the way a tuning fork catches frequency. Not through effort. Through the simple fact of being pitched correctly. The phrase translated roughly as, "The route he's proposing cuts through Martinez territory. He knows this. He's testing whether we know." She noted it. Said nothing. Noted him. The meeting proceeded through its careful choreography. Coffee appeared. Nobody poured it for her. She didn't reach for it. Sat with her hands in her lap, listening. 20 minutes in one of the Sicilian delegation older man compact, unhurried with the manner of someone who'd outlived every prediction made about him, switched briefly into a Western interior dialect that shared significant architecture with Odessa's Siculu Antico. Enough that Celestia could follow it almost completely. He was telling his second that the Houston contingent's financial projections were deliberately understated, designed to justify a larger percentage of the proposed joint venture than their actual investment warranted. The second nodded, made notes, continued smiling at the Houston delegation with practiced warmth. 45 minutes. The silver-haired Calabrian again, this time discussing money in one dialect and discussing people in another. 2 different linguistic registers for 2 different kinds of truth. Celestia catalogued all of it. The divergences, the suppressions, the tells. Built a complete map of the room carried in the same interior architecture where she'd always stored what she observed. By the lunch interval, she knew which men were lying, which were being lied to, and which were performing ignorance while knowing exactly what was being hidden. Dante appeared at her side during the break, ostensibly refilling his own coffee. Didn't look at her. Said one word in Siculu Antico, quiet enough that it existed only in the 6 inches between them. Well, Celestia considered the room. Considered the silver-haired man who thought nobody could hear his Calabrian asides. Considered the Houston delegation's creative accounting. Considered the Sicilian elder who was gathering information while pretending not to understand English well enough to follow the formal presentations. She said in the dialect 4 words, 3 people are lying. Dante moved away without responding, but she saw in the set of his shoulders as he crossed back to his position something that on this man constituted satisfaction. The meeting reconvened, proceeded through afternoon into early evening. At some point food appeared, oysters, shrimp bread that steamed when broken. Celestia ate without tasting her attention, locked on the layered conversations happening in 3 languages simultaneously. When it ended, the men filed out with handshakes and promises to reconvene tomorrow. Dante waited until the room emptied, except for Celestia and Rafe. "Tell me." She did. Named the Calabrian's deception about territorial knowledge. Identified the Houston delegation's financial manipulation. Noted the Sicilian elder's comprehensive understanding of information he was pretending not to possess. Dante listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Rafe. "Verify the Martinez boundary claim. If she's right, we adjust our counter-proposal before tomorrow's session." Rafe left. Dante turned back to Celestia. "The Sicilian elder, Don Petrocelli, what else did you hear from him? He's playing both sides, taking information from these meetings and feeding it to someone outside the negotiation. probably Chicago family based on the reference to northern arrangements and seasonal shipping patterns through the Great Lakes. Dante's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention sharpened. You got all that from his dialect choices. The dialect tells you where someone's from. The way they use it tells you who they're talking to. Don Petrocelli switches registers when discussing certain topics, uses the formal Sicilian for official positions, drops into Agriento Highland patterns when he's being truthful, and uses a hybrid coastal interior mix when he's managing information for multiple audiences. That hybrid pattern is specific to families who maintained connections between Sicily and American operations during Prohibition. Chicago ran those routes. Dante was quiet for a long moment. Isabeau was good. She could identify lies and track territorial claims, but she couldn't do this. She heard the words. You hear the architecture. My grandmother said the language is a key, but it's not just about translation. It's about understanding that every choice someone makes about which words to use and how to use them is a choice about who they are and who they're trying to be. Dante walked to the window, looked down at Bienville Street, where evening was settling into the quarter's familiar rhythm of neon and music and commerce conducted in shadows. Tomorrow, same time, different location. I'll send a car at 9:30. Celestia stood. The money, the 5,000. What about it? I need to know what happens if I don't make it to day 11. Dante turned from the window. If you don't make it to day 11, the money goes to your sister. Full amount. 17,000. Tulane tuition gets paid, she finishes her degree. She never knows what you were doing to make it happen. The words landed with the weight of contract terms that had been considered long before this conversation. Celestia understood suddenly that Dante had planned for her potential death with the same methodical attention he planned everything else. The contingency was already established, the arrangements already made. How long have you been looking for me? Since Isabeau died. My people found 3 possibilities. You were the third. The first 2 are still working their regular jobs, unaware they were ever being considered. You spoke siculu antico to me without being asked. You chose yourself. And if I hadn't, then we'd be having this conversation with someone else. Or we wouldn't be having it at all. Celestia walked toward the door, paused at the threshold. Isabeau, you said she heard something she shouldn't have. What was it? Dante's reflection in the window watched the street, not her. She heard someone in my organization making promises they had no authority to make, selling information they had no right to sell. She thought she could leverage that knowledge into more money, better position. She was wrong about what leverage means in this world. And you killed her for it. No, I would have paid her to keep quiet and found another translator. Someone else killed her. Someone who couldn't afford to have her talking. Which means someone in my organization is still selling information, and Isabeau died because she couldn't identify who fast enough. Celestia's hand rested on the doorframe. You're using me as bait. I'm using you as a translator. If someone tries to kill you for what you hear, that tells me who they are. If they don't, you collect your money and go back to the Opal Room. Either way, the summit happens, the treaty gets signed, and the friction that's been killing people stops killing people. And Serafina gets her tuition regardless. Regardless. Celestia stepped through the door. Rafe waited in the hallway to escort her out. Behind her, Dante remained at the window, a silhouette against the evening light, watching New Orleans settle into darkness with the patient attention of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the most important information reveals itself in the spaces between what people choose to say and what they cannot help but mean. The shotgun house felt different when Celestia returned that night. Not physically altered. Same narrow rooms arranged like train cars, same water-stained ceiling in the kitchen, same brass doorknob that stuck in humid weather. But the space had changed shape around the knowledge that she now carried $17,000 worth of obligation and exactly 10 days to survive collecting it. She didn't call Serafina, composed the conversation 3 times in her mind while standing under the shower's weak pressure, letting water the temperature of blood run over shoulders that ached from 6 hours of sitting motionless while men negotiated the price of peace in 3 languages simultaneously. The version where she told the truth. The version where she lied convincingly. The version where she said nothing about money and asked instead about the architecture thesis, the studio hours, whether her sister was eating anything besides the cafeteria's approximation of food, made none of them. Instead, she opened her laptop on the kitchen table and typed Isabeau Thibault Obituary New Orleans into the search bar. The results loaded with the casual efficiency of algorithms that didn't understand they were cataloging someone's last translation from living to dead. The Times-Picayune had given her 4 paragraphs. Isabeau Marie Thibault, 31, found deceased April 14th in Bayou Sauvage. Survived by her mother Claire, her cousin Margot, several aunts and uncles who'd apparently been important enough to list by name, but not important enough to warrant explanation. Services held at St. Louis Cathedral, in lieu of flowers donations to the New Orleans Women's Shelter. No mention of how she'd died. No speculation about why. The obituary performed its function with the mechanical discretion of text that had been edited by someone who understood which details attracted unwanted attention. Celestia clicked through to the archived news coverage. 3 articles progressively shorter as the story lost its purchase on public interest. The first had run the day after discovery, body found in Bayou police investigating, with enough vague language about ongoing inquiries to suggest the NOPD knew exactly what kind of investigation this was and had already decided how much effort it deserved. The second article, 5 days later, noted that the victim had worked as a freelance translator. No mention of her clients, no interviews with employers. Just the sterile notation that she'd been found with her throat cut and her purse missing, as though robbery had been the motive and the precision of the wound was irrelevant detail. The third article, 2 weeks after the body surfaced, announced that the investigation remained open, but had produced no viable leads. Anyone with information was encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers. Translation: Isabeau Thibault's murder would join the city's extensive catalog of violence that got filed under unsolved, because solving it would require asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. Celestia closed the laptop, reached for her phone instead, searched for Margot Thibault on the social media platforms where people left digital breadcrumbs of their lives without understanding they were creating maps for anyone who knew how to read them. Found her. 33 years old based on the birthday posts. Worked at a law firm on Waitress Street doing paralegal work. Recent photos showed a woman with Isabeau's bone structure, and none of her ease grief had carved new geography into Margot's face, the kind that doesn't fade with time, but settles into permanent architecture. Celestia sent a message through the platform's private channel. "My name is Celestia Vale. I'm working the job your cousin had before she died. I need to talk to you about what she knew." Hit send before the reasonable part of her brain could compose objections. The message showed as delivered, then read within 90 seconds. The typing indicator appeared, pulsed for a full minute, disappeared without producing response. Celestia waited, set the phone on the table, watched it not ring. 20 minutes later the reply arrived, "Café du Monde, tomorrow, 8 a.m. Come alone. If I see anyone who looks like security, I'm gone." The next morning crystallized around the quarter with the particular clarity that follows storms, though no storm had passed, just the Gulf's atmospheric pressure making promises about weather that would arrive by afternoon. Celestia walked to Café du Monde through air that tasted like rain, deciding whether to commit. The café sprawled at the corner of Decatur and Street, and perpetually full, perpetually loud, the kind of establishment that had achieved such complete tourist saturation that locals only went there to prove they could still claim ownership of their own city's landmarks. Green and white striped awning. Beignets served 3 to an order under avalanches of powdered sugar. Coffee that came black or olé with no accommodation for preference more complicated than that. Margot Thibault sat at a corner table with sightlines to both entrances, nursing café au lait gone cold, checking her phone with the repeated motion of someone whose hands needed occupation. She looked up when Celestia approached. Brown eyes tracked her path, cataloging, measuring, looking for the tells that would indicate threat or deception or whatever other dangers paralegal work had taught her to recognize. Celestia sat without asking permission, ordered beignets she had no intention of eating, and coffee that arrived in a cup the size of a soup bowl. Neither of them spoke until the server left. Margot broke first. "You don't look like someone who translates for mobsters." "What do I look like?" "My cousin. Before she started working for Dante Corvo. Before she figured out that being good at your job in that world just makes you more valuable dead than alive." The words carried weight that suggested they'd been rehearsed, refined through repetition until they achieved the particular sharpness that comes from grief hardening into anger. Celestia let the silence hold for a moment before responding. "Isabeau found something. Evidence of someone selling information. She tried to leverage it. That's what got her killed." Margot's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. "Is that what Dante told you? That Isabeau got greedy? That she overplayed her hand?" She leaned forward, voice dropping to the register people use when they need to be heard but not overheard. "Isabeau was terrified for 2 weeks before she died, calling me at midnight saying she'd made copies, hidden them, left instructions about where to find them if anything happened. She wasn't trying to get rich. She was trying to stay alive long enough to get out." "Out of what?" "Out of the job. Out of New Orleans. She had a teaching position lined up at a university in Oregon starting fall semester. Italian department. Legitimate work. Far enough from Louisiana that whatever she knew wouldn't matter anymore." Celestia absorbed this recalibration. The story Dante had told translator gets greedy, pays the price had the convenient simplicity of narratives designed to discourage questions. This version had the complicated texture of truth. The copies, the evidence. "Where are they?" Margot pulled something from her purse. Small leather journal worn at the edges, the kind sold in bookstores that catered to people who still believed in the romance of handwriting. Set it on the table between them with the delicate precision of someone handling explosives. "She left this with me 3 days before she died. Said if anything happened, give it to the police. But after she turned up in the bayou with her throat cut and the investigation went nowhere in 48 hours, I realized the police either couldn't help or wouldn't. So I kept it, waiting for someone who could." Celestia didn't reach for the journal. Not yet. Kept her hands wrapped around the coffee cup's warmth. "Why give it to me?" "You don't know me. For all you know, I'm working with whoever killed her. You came alone. You're not trying to intimidate me or buy my silence. And you asked the right question, not what did she know, but where is the evidence? Someone working for the killer would already know what she found. They'd be here to make sure it stayed buried, not to dig it up." Logic that held together if you accepted that Margot possessed the kind of operational security that came from either paranoia or experience. Celestia suspected both. She reached for the journal, opened it to pages filled with Isabeau's handwriting. Neat, compact, the script of someone who'd learned penmanship from nuns and never unlearned the discipline. Most of the entries were mundane. Notes about meetings, vocabulary lists for obscure dialect variations, reminders about pronunciation. Then, 2/3 through the entries changed character, became observational rather than educational. Dates and locations and brief descriptions. April 2nd riverfront meeting, overheard VM. On phone in Sickaloo speaking to Houston contact, discussing shipment routes through Galveston. Routes Dante explicitly declined in yesterday's negotiation. April 5th Commander's Palace dinner. VM arrived 30 minutes early. Saw him pass envelope to man I don't recognize. Man left before Dante arrived. VM later referenced the man as our Houston insurance in private conversation with nephew. April 8th 5M. Used specific dialect phrase that translates to "the table is ready." Same phrase used in 1978 Palermo assassination signal, confirmed in Nona's old letters. This phrase doesn't appear in social contexts, only operational. The entries ended April 11th, 3 days before Isabeau's body surfaced in Bayou Sauvage. Celestia looked up from the journal. V.M. Vincenzo Marchand. Margot's expression confirmed before her words did. Don Salvatore Marchand's younger brother, retired from active operations 15 years ago after a stroke, lives in a house on Esplanade Avenue and collects a pension from the family, supposedly harmless. Isabeau didn't think so. Did she tell Dante what she suspected? She tried. Dante wouldn't hear it. Vincenzo is family. Dante's father grew up with him, trusted him, left instructions in his will that Vincenzo be cared for in retirement. Questioning Vincenzo meant questioning Dante's father's judgment. Isabeau said it was like trying to convince someone their grandfather was secretly a traitor. The evidence didn't matter. The relationship was too deep. Celestia turned to the journal's final entry. April 11th. Single sentence. Trust no one. Initials 5M. Verify at source before approaching Dante again. Below that, an address on Esplanade Avenue, Vincenzo Marchand's residence. She was going to confront him directly. Margot nodded, her hands now shaking around the coffee cup. I told her not to. Told her to take what she had and run. Oregon was waiting. The teaching job was real. She could disappear. The words cracked on the last syllable. She said she owed Dante the truth. That he'd protected her, paid her fairly, deserved to know someone in his organization was bleeding information to competitors. She thought loyalty mattered. It got her killed. It got her killed. Celestia closed the journal, slid it into her bag with the envelope containing $5,000 that suddenly felt like blood money. The phone. You said Isabeau recorded something. Is it in here? Margot shook her head. She kept audio files on her phone, backed them up to a cloud service. After she died, I tried to access the account, but it's password protected and I can't guess the security questions. Her phone itself went missing. Police said it probably got stolen along with her purse. I think whoever killed her took it to delete the evidence. But the cloud backup still exists. If you can access it, if the files haven't been deleted remotely, if whoever killed her doesn't know about the backup or hasn't already had it wiped by someone with the right technical skills. A lot of ifs. Celestia added them to the growing column of uncertainties that seemed to define her new employment. She stood, left $20 on the table for coffee and beignets neither of them had touched. Thank you for this, for trusting me. Margot looked up at her with eyes that had seen one family member buried and weren't particularly interested in attending another funeral. Don't thank me. Just don't end up like Isabeau. Don't convince yourself that loyalty to Dante Corvo is worth dying for. Men like him collect people who think they matter. You're a tool to him, a useful one right now. But tools break. Tools get replaced. And when you break, he won't mourn you. He'll just find the next translator who speaks the language nobody else remembers. Celestia left the cafe carrying a dead woman's journal and the weight of warnings she couldn't afford to ignore but had no intention of heeding. The quarter was waking fully now, delivery trucks competing with trash collection for the finite space between buildings that had been standing when loyalty still meant something other than temporary convenience. She walked back to Dauphine Street, locked the door. Spread Isabeau's journal open on the kitchen table beside her laptop and began the work of translating evidence into action. The cloud storage service Isabeau had used was one of the major providers. Millions of accounts, enterprise-level security, the kind of system that would require either exceptional hacking skills or exceptional luck to penetrate. Celestia possessed neither, but she possessed something potentially more useful: knowledge of how people who grew up in tight-knit communities constructed their security questions. Family names, childhood addresses, the names of first pets or favorite teachers or saints whose intercession had been sought during crisis. Information that felt personal and secure but was actually semi-public if you knew where to look. Celestia started with the obvious. Thibault family genealogy websites, social media posts from relatives who hadn't learned the discipline of privacy settings, obituaries for Isabeau's grandparents that listed surviving children and grandchildren in meticulous detail. Third attempt unlocked the account. Security question. What was your maternal grandmother's maiden name? Answer: Boudreaux. The cloud storage dashboard loaded with the anticlimactic efficiency of systems that don't understand the significance of what they're protecting. 47 files. Most were audio recordings labeled with dates and locations. The most recent was April 10th, one day before Isabeau's final journal entry. Celestia clicked it. The file played through her laptop's speakers with the compressed quality of phone recordings made in environments not designed for acoustic clarity. Background noise first. Traffic. Voices at a distance. Then closer, Isabeau's breathing, the rustle of fabric suggesting the phone was in a pocket or purse microphone, muffled but functional. Then voices. Two men speaking in the Sicalu Antico that Celestia's ear recognized before her conscious mind translated. One voice old, graveled, carrying the particular hoarseness that comes from years of smoking or shouting, or both. The other, younger, deferential, the tone of someone addressing authority. The old voice belonged to Vincenzo Marchand. Celestia knew this with the certainty that comes from hours spent listening to dialect variations, learning to identify not just what people said, but how the shape of their mouth and the rhythm of their breathing created the unique signature of their speech. Vincenzo was saying, "The Houston families are prepared to move on our signal. Summit is scheduled for the 17th. Dante thinks he's negotiating peace. What he's actually doing is gathering everyone in one location where they can be managed simultaneously." The younger voice, Celestia didn't recognize it, which meant it wasn't someone from Dante's inner circle, responded, "And Don Salvatore, your brother. My brother is old, sentimental. He thinks family legacy matters more than operational efficiency. After the summit, he'll understand that the organization needs younger leadership. Leadership that understands the future belongs to those willing to make difficult choices." The nephew, Niccolo. He's positioned. He'll give the signal. 3 toasts, using the old phrase. He doesn't know what it means. Thinks it's just traditional blessing. By the time he understands he was the trigger, the room will already be in motion. The recording continued for another 90 seconds. Details about which Houston operators would be positioned where, what the signal protocol entailed, how the aftermath would be managed to look like spontaneous violence rather than coordinated execution. Then, Isabeau's voice, barely audible, "I have to stop this." The recording ended. Celestia sat in the silence that followed, understanding now why Isabeau had died. She hadn't just discovered evidence of betrayal. She'd recorded a confession of conspiracy to commit mass murder. Vincenzo Marchand wasn't selling information for money. He was orchestrating a coup designed to eliminate both his brother and Dante, installing his nephew as puppet leadership, while Houston families absorbed Louisiana territory. The summit was in 9 days. Celestia's phone vibrated against the table. Text from unknown number. "Car arrives 9:30, Commander's Palace. Wear something that doesn't wrinkle. Dante." Today's meeting. She looked at the journal at the laptop, still playing the silence where Isabeau's voice had been, at the reflection of her own face in the window glass, 26 years old, and carrying information that would either prevent a massacre or guarantee her own throat got cut in a bayou before the week ended. The reasonable choice was obvious. Take the journal to Dante. Play him the recording. Let him handle Vincenzo through whatever methods men like him employed when family betrayed family. Collect the remaining $12,000. Walk away with Serafina's tuition paid and a story she'd never be able to tell anyone. But Isabeau had tried that approach, had attempted to bring Dante evidence that his father's oldest friend was a traitor. Dante hadn't listened. Family loyalty had been stronger than facts, and Isabeau had died trying to do the right thing in a world where right and wrong were adjectives that applied to profit margins rather than morality. Celestia closed the laptop, put the journal in her bag, dressed in clothes that wouldn't wrinkle, walked downstairs at 9:25 to meet a car that would take her to Commander's Palace, where she would sit invisibly among men negotiating peace while carrying proof that peace was theatrical misdirection for planned slaughter. The car was a different model than yesterday. Black sedan driver who didn't introduce himself, route that took St. Charles Avenue through the Garden District, where mansions posed behind iron fences and oak trees older than the Confederacy provided shade that felt like historical judgment. Commander's Palace occupied the corner of Washington Avenue and Coliseum Street in Victorian splendor, turquoise and white exterior, multiple galleries, the kind of establishment where presidents had dined and proposals had been accepted and fortunes had been made and lost over turtle soup and bread pudding. Rafe waited at the entrance. "Second floor, private dining room, same protocol as yesterday." He led her through the main restaurant lunch service in full execution waitstaff, moving with the choreographed precision of people who understood that timing was the difference between excellence and disaster, up the curved staircase to a room that held 14 men this time instead of 12. Dante sat in the same position as yesterday, 3 chairs from center, not claiming dominance, simply present. The 2 new faces belonged to Houston. Celestia identified them before they spoke based purely on how they held themselves, the loose confidence of people operating in territory they considered already conquered, just waiting for the formalities to conclude. She took her position beside Dante, folded her hands, became furniture. The meeting proceeded through its established rhythm. Italian on the surface, dialect underneath. Men performing negotiation while the real communication happened in the coded registers that only certain ears could parse. Celestia tracked all of it, built her map, noted who lied and who didn't, who understood what was actually being discussed and who was being deliberately kept ignorant. But mostly she watched for Vincenzo Marchand. He wasn't present. Retired, supposedly, living on pension and memories. No reason for him to attend working sessions. Don Salvatore Marchand sat at the table's head, 71 years old, and solid white hair combed back from a face that had the weathered quality of someone who'd spent decades outdoors before wealth moved him inside. His nephew Niccolo sat 3 chairs down, 30 years old and handsome in the particular way that suggested excellent genes and expensive grooming. Niccolo was nervous. Celestia saw it in how he checked his phone, in the way his fingers drummed against the table's edge, in the fact that he'd touched his water glass 6 times without drinking. A man waiting for something. A man given instructions he didn't fully understand but feared the consequences of failing to execute. The meeting broke for lunch. Food appeared: oysters, Rockefeller, shrimp, remoulade, soft-shell crab that had been swimming in Lake Pontchartrain that morning. Celestia ate without tasting, her attention locked on Niccolo. He made a phone call, stepped out to the gallery, voice low, body language suggesting anxiety rather than conspiracy. Celestia couldn't hear the conversation but could read its shape: questions being asked, reassurance being sought, instructions being confirmed. When he returned, his jaw was set with the particular determination of someone who decided commitment was easier than doubt. The afternoon session resumed. Discussions about profit-sharing arrangements, territory boundaries, dispute resolution protocols. The architecture of peace built in careful increments by men who understood that the failure to maintain it would be expensive for everyone. 3 hours in Niccolo cleared his throat. Before we conclude today, I'd like to offer a traditional blessing, something my Uncle Vincenzo taught me, old Sicilian custom for sealing agreements. The room's energy shifted fractionally. Men who'd been half attentive suddenly focused. Don Salvatore smiled with grandfatherly pride. Dante's expression didn't change, but Celestia felt him go still beside her in the way that suggested every nerve had just gone active. Niccolo raised his water glass, spoke in Siculo Antico. "May the table hold what the day has taken." Standard blessing, the kind passed through families like silverware. Benediction, invocation of restoration and peace. Except the vowel in the 4th word was wrong, subtle. A native speaker might not catch it. Someone who'd learned the dialect academically would hear it as regional variation. But someone who'd grown up with Odessa, who'd absorbed the language before understanding language itself, was something that could be learned, heard it clearly. The closed vowel, the shift from open sound to compressed, the transformation that changed restoration to readiness. The table is ready. Niccolo repeated it. 2nd time, same vowel shift. Around the table, the older men, the ones whose grandmothers had spoken this dialect, who'd absorbed it the same way Celestia had, went very still. They'd heard it too, heard the signal that didn't belong in peace negotiations, heard the echo of Palermo 1978 when those exact words had preceded coordinated assassination during a treaty dinner. Niccolo said it a 3rd time, 3 repetitions, confirmation of receipt. The protocol Isabeau had documented. Celestia's hand moved without conscious decision, reached for the water pitcher on the table, lifting it with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 4 years performing invisible service. leaned across the white linen to refill Dante's glass, the movement bringing her within 6 inches of his ear. She spoke 7 words in Sicalu Antico so quietly they existed only in the register between whisper and breath. Niccolo just gave the readiness signal. 3 repetitions. Protocol confirmed. She straightened, set the pitcher down, returned to her chair. Dante's expression didn't change. Not a flicker, not a recalibration. His face remained exactly as it had been, composed, attentive, the face of a man enjoying productive negotiation. Only his hand moved. Found the tablecloth in the same way Celestia's had found it at the Opal Room. Flat, deliberate. The physical acknowledgement of information received and being processed. 3 seconds passed. Perhaps 4. Then Dante smiled. Warm, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of someone who'd just arrived at a pleasant decision. He addressed Don Salvatore across the table. The evening has been exceptional. The progress we've made today deserves proper acknowledgement. I've arranged for us to continue this discussion at a different venue tonight, somewhere with better acoustics for the kind of candor that good wine and good faith deserve. He was already standing as he said it, which meant everyone else was standing too, because that's how it works when the man who called the meeting decides it's time to leave. The room rose, jackets retrieved. Don Salvatore embraced Dante with what appeared to be genuine affection, speaking about looking forward to the continuation. Niccolo stood at his uncle's side, confusion beginning to crack through the determination on his face. The Houston delegation moved toward the exit with the others, their body language suggesting they'd expected something different from this session. Expected conclusion rather than adjournment. Dante's security distributed themselves through the room's geography, herding the departure with practiced efficiency. Rafe positioned himself near Celestia, close enough that his presence communicated protection without the vulgarity of making it obvious. They filed out, down the curved staircase, through the main dining room where lunch service continued in oblivious normalcy, out onto Washington Avenue where the afternoon had delivered on its morning's threat, rain falling in sheets that turned the street into a river and the Garden District into a watercolor running at the edges. Cars waited. Different vehicles then had delivered them. Dante's hand on Celestia's elbow guided her toward the lead sedan. She got in. He followed. Rafe took the front passenger seat. The driver pulled into traffic without asking destination. Dante didn't speak for 3 blocks. Just looked at the rain transforming New Orleans into something liquid and uncertain, his reflection in the window as still as his physical body. Finally, "How certain are you?" Celestia kept her voice level, factual, the tone of someone reporting observations rather than making accusations. "Completely." The vowel shift was deliberate. The 3 repetitions followed the 1978 Palermo Protocol. Niccolo was given that phrase by someone who knows its historical significance. He doesn't understand what he said, but someone taught him to say it exactly that way, at exactly that moment. Someone. She reached into her bag, pulled out Isabeau's journal, set it on the seat between them. Vincenzo Marchand, your father's oldest friend, Don Salvatore's younger brother. He's been selling information to Houston for months, planning to use the summit as cover for simultaneous elimination of leadership. Installing Niccolo as puppet while Houston absorbs Louisiana territory. Dante looked at the journal without touching it. Isabeau's. Her cousin gave it to me this morning, along with access to audio recordings Isabeau made before she died. Vincenzo discussing the plan in detail, using the exact phrase Niccolo just repeated. Isabeau tried to bring you this evidence, you didn't listen. Family loyalty was stronger than facts. She died trying to warn you. The silence that followed had weight, had texture, had the particular quality of air before lightning decides where to strike. Dante picked up the journal, opened it, read through Isabeau's entries with the methodical attention of someone processing information that was rearranging his understanding of reality. When he finished, he looked at Rafe. Verify Vincenzo's location. I want to know where he is right now, who he's spoken to in the last 48 hours, and what his schedule looks like for the next 9 days. Rafe made calls, quiet conversations in the front seat while rain drummed against the roof and the city slid past in blurred motion. Dante turned to Celestia. The recordings. Can you access them? She pulled out her phone, navigated to the cloud storage account, played the April 10th file through the car's speakers. Vincenzo's voice filled the sedan, old, certain, describing conspiracy with the casual confidence of someone who'd never seriously considered the possibility of being caught. The recording ended. The rain continued. The car turned onto Magazine Street, heading toward the river through neighborhoods where antebellum architecture posed beside shotgun houses and chain-link fences separated wealth from its consequences. Dante's hands were flat on his knees, the gesture of someone keeping themselves perfectly still through conscious effort. My father trusted him, grew up with him, left explicit instructions in his will that Vincenzo be cared for in retirement, that his pension be guaranteed, that he be included in family decisions even if he no longer held operational authority. Your father was wrong. My father was rarely wrong about people. He was wrong about Vincenzo. The car stopped. Celestia looked out the window. They were parked on Chupatula Street in front of a warehouse that had been renovated into something between office space and Fortress security cameras' reinforced doors. The aesthetic of commerce conducted by people who understood that legitimate business and illegitimate business often required the same architectural features. Dante got out. Celestia followed. Rafe led them through a side entrance that required 3 separate key cards and 1 biometric scan up an industrial elevator to the 3rd floor where exposed brick met modern technology in the service of operations that didn't advertise themselves. The office was minimal. Desk, chairs, windows overlooking the river where container ships moved with the slow determination of commerce that didn't care about human drama. Walls bare except for a single photograph. Dante's father, she assumed based on the facial similarity and the fact that the photo showed a man in his 60s standing with Vincenzo Marchand, both of them smiling in the way people smile when they believe friendship is permanent. Dante sat behind the desk, gestured for Celestia to take the chair opposite. Rafe remained standing near the door with the posture of someone who'd learned vigilance the way other people learned breathing. "We have a problem." Celestia waited. "I can't just kill Vincenzo. Doing so without public justification violates the treaty structure my father built. Don Salvatore would be obligated to respond. We'd have war across the Gulf Coast. Exactly what the Houston families want Louisiana organizations destroying each other while they expand into the vacuum. So we expose him publicly, at the summit, in front of all the families. Using what a dead translator's journal and recordings that could have been fabricated, Vincenzo will deny everything. Claim Isabeau was trying to extort him, that the recordings are manipulated. Half the room will believe him because they want to believe him, because accepting that someone at his level could betray the organization means accepting that anyone could. Trust collapses. We get war anyway." Celestia leaned forward. "Then we make him confess, in his own words, in front of witnesses who can't be dismissed." "How?" she told him. Explained the plan that had been forming since Niccolo gave the toast. The translation trap. The way to use the dialect itself as weapon. Making Vincenzo reveal himself through the only language he couldn't hide behind. When she finished, Dante was quiet for a long moment. "If this fails, we both die. Vincenzo will have shooters positioned. The Houston families will move regardless. And every family in that room will remember that I let a waitress destroy the peace my father spent 40 years building. If it succeeds, you prevent a massacre and expose the traitor without triggering war. And if I'm wrong about you, if you're the one selling information, and this is all misdirection..." Celestia met his eyes across the desk. "Then you kill me. Same way someone killed Isabeau. Throat cut, bayou, problem solved." His expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention suggested he was measuring the distance between the person sitting across from him and the person he'd met 3 days ago at the Opal Room. "You've changed since Tuesday. Tuesday I was a waitress trying to pay my sister's tuition. Today I'm carrying a dead woman's evidence and planning to prevent mass murder using grammar. People change when the circumstances require it. Or they reveal what they always were." "Maybe both." Dante turned to look at the river. Container ships, cranes, the machinery of commerce that didn't stop for conspiracy or betrayal or the small human dramas that played out in the spaces between profit and loss. When he turned back, his face had the particular stillness that meant a decision had been made. 9 days until the summit. I'll arrange the venue. You'll sit where you've been sitting. When Vincenzo speaks, and he will speak, he won't be able to resist the moment you'll translate his Italian correctly for the room. But when he drops into Sicalo Antico for what he thinks are private remarks, you'll translate his confession instead of his words, making him admit in the old tongue what he'd never say in English. The old guard dons will hear both versions. They'll know what he actually said versus what I claim he said. Exactly. And when they realize he's confessing to conspiracy in a language he thinks protects him, they'll understand the betrayal is real, not fabricated, not misinterpreted, his own words condemning him. Celestia nodded. And if Vincenzo has a counter-move, if he's planned for this, then we improvise, or we die. Those are the only two options once we commit. He stood, extended his hand across the desk. Celestia took it. His grip was firm, brief, carrying the weight of contract terms that couldn't be written down because writing them would make them evidence. Thank you for bringing this to me, for trusting me with it despite what happened to Isabeau. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because $17,000 won't matter if I'm dead, and I'd prefer to collect payment rather than become the second translator who knew too much. Dante almost smiled. Honest. I appreciate that more than you realize. He released her hand, nodded to Rafe. Take her home, secure perimeter. Nobody gets close to her between now and the summit without my explicit authorization. Celestia left the office carrying Isabeau's journal and the knowledge that she'd just committed to a plan that would either save her life or guarantee its violent conclusion. The rain had stopped. The city emerged from the storm looking cleaned rather than cleansed, the difference being that dirt washes off but stains require different treatment. The drive back to Dauphine Street took 17 minutes. Rafe walked her to the door, posted one of Dante's men on the corner with sight lines to both approaches, made it clear through tone and posture that her safety was now operational priority. Inside the shotgun house, Celestia locked the door, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with her phone and the crushing awareness that she had 9 days to either master a performance that would convince 7 crime families of a truth they didn't want to believe or die trying. She called Serafina. Her sister answered on the second ring voice, bright with the particular optimism of 22-year-olds who still believed architecture could save the world. Hey, I was just going to text you. Professor loved the thesis proposal. Said it showed real promise. Celestia closed her eyes, listened to her sister's happiness, let it fill the space where fear had been accumulating. That's wonderful. I'm proud of you. Are you okay? You sound tired. Long shifts, but I picked up some extra work. Good money. Should have the tuition covered by next week. You don't have to do that. I can take out more loans. You're not taking out more loans. Focus on the thesis. Let me handle the money. Silence on the line. Then, quietly, I love you. You know that, right? I know. I love you too. After she hung up, Celestia sat in the silence that held her shape and thought about Odessa. About a woman who'd done this exact work for 40 years and survived. About what survival required when the cost of failure was a throat cut and a bayou that accepted bodies without asking questions about what they'd known or who they'd trusted. She opened Isabeau's journal one more time, read through the entries again, stopped at the final page where a single sentence waited. The language is a key, but keys only work if you're willing to walk through the door they open. Odessa had said something similar, different words, same meaning. Celestia closed the journal, looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. 26 years old, 9 days from either salvation or slaughter. No longer invisible, no longer furniture. For better or worse, she'd walked through the door. Now she just had to survive what waited on the other side. The 8 working days collapsed into a sequence of hotel conference rooms and restaurant private dining spaces where men negotiated the terms of peace, while Celestia sat 3 chairs from center building an encyclopedia of lies told in 3 languages simultaneously. Dante's security formed a perimeter around her life that she stopped noticing by day 4, the way you stop noticing breathing when it becomes automatic. Rafe drove her to meetings. Someone she never saw checked the shotgun house for devices that shouldn't exist. Her phone acquired encryption she didn't request and couldn't disable. Serafina texted daily updates about the thesis renderings of sustainable housing projects, professor feedback studio all-nighters fueled by coffee, and the kind of optimism that came from believing buildings could solve problems politics created. Celestia responded with enthusiasm. She didn't feel typing reassurance while sitting in rooms where men discussed profit margins derived from human misery with the clinical detachment of accountants balancing ledgers. She didn't tell her sister that she'd stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Didn't mention waking at 2 a.m. to reread Isabeau's journal, searching for details she might have missed, patterns that would reveal whether the translation trap would work or simply accelerate her own murder. Didn't describe the weight of carrying information that would either prevent massacre or guarantee it, depending entirely on her ability to hear what was meant beneath what was said and translate betrayal into confession using a language most of the world had forgotten existed. By day 6, she could identify each family's representative by dialect alone. The Houston contingent favored a bastardized Neapolitan that had absorbed Texas inflection over 4 generations. The Baton Rouge crew spoke coastal Sicilian with French vowels creeping in at the edges. Don Salvatore's people used the interior Highland patterns that Odessa had carried, though none of them possessed her fluency. They'd learned it as heritage rather than mother tongue. The difference being that heritage could be performed while mother tongue was simply what your mouth did when it stopped thinking. Vincenzo Marchand attended one session. Day 7. Showed up at Antoine's restaurant during the afternoon break, ostensibly to deliver regards from retired associates who wished the negotiations well. 71 years old, white-haired, moving with the careful precision of someone whose stroke had left permanent neurological reminders about mortality. He smiled at Don Salvatore with grandfatherly warmth, shook hands with the Houston delegation like they were distant acquaintances rather than co-conspirators, spoke to Dante about his father's legacy with the kind of affection that would have been touching if Celestia hadn't spent a week listening to recordings of this same man planning to murder everyone in the room. He glanced at Celestia once. Brief assessment. The way you glance at furniture to confirm it's still performing its function. She kept her face blank, her posture unremarkable, her hands folded in her lap like someone whose thoughts were elsewhere and irrelevant. When he left, she watched him go. Tracked his movement through the dining room out onto St. Louis Street, where afternoon sun turned the quarter's architecture into something that belonged in paintings rather than postcards. He walked without hurry, a man who believed his plans were proceeding exactly as designed. Dante appeared at her shoulder after Vincenzo's departure, voice pitched low. Tomorrow, the summit. Antoine Restaurant's 3rd-floor private room, 7 families, 43 men total. Vincenzo will attend as Marchand family elder. Niccolo will be there. The Houston delegation's bringing their full operational leadership. Positioning. You'll sit where you've been sitting, 3 chairs from my position. Vincenzo will be at the opposite end near Don Salvatore. Geography matters. When he speaks in Siculu Antico, he needs to believe you can't hear him clearly, that he's having a private conversation with his brother across table noise and ambient sound. But the old guard dons will hear him. They'll hear both versions, what he actually says in the dialect versus what you claim he said in English. When those versions don't match, they'll pay attention. And when they realize he's confessing to conspiracy in a language he thinks protects him, the room will turn. Celestia's hands stayed folded, steady, giving away nothing about the fact that her heart was attempting to exit her chest through her throat. And if they don't believe me, if Vincenzo convinces them I'm mistranslating deliberately, then we have approximately 15 seconds before the Houston shooters open fire, and this becomes the bloodiest night in New Orleans history since the Axeman killings. He walked away before she could formulate response, left her sitting in Antoine's elegant dining room with the remainder of the afternoon session to survive, and the crushing awareness that tomorrow she would either prevent mass murder using grammar or become another body that the Bayou accepted without asking questions. That night she couldn't stay in the shotgun house. The walls felt too close, the silence too heavy with the accumulated weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. She walked instead, through the Marini into the quarter past Jackson Square, where artists packed up their easels and tarot readers folded their tables, and the cathedral stood witness to the city's nightly transformation from tourist destination to something older and less interested in performing for cameras. She ended up at Café du Monde, ordered beignets and coffee, sat at a table facing Decatur Street where tourists stumbled past in various states of intoxication and locals moved with the practiced efficiency of people navigating a city they knew better than the maps claimed. Her phone buzzed. Text from Margot. Heard through the paralegal network that something big is scheduled for tomorrow. Multiple families, high level. Please tell me you're not walking into what Isabeau walked into. Celestia stared at the message, composed 3 different responses, sent none of them. Instead she called Serafina. Her sister answered immediately, background noise suggesting she was still in the architecture studio at 9 p.m. on a Friday. Hey, is everything okay? You never call this late? Everything's fine. Just wanted to hear your voice. Silence on the line. Then carefully, You're scaring me. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I picked up that extra work I mentioned. It finishes tomorrow. After that, tuition's covered. Everything's handled. The work, is it safe? Celestia looked at the coffee going cold in front of her, at the powdered sugar she hadn't touched at the city, continuing its ordinary business while she prepared to walk into a room where 43 men would negotiate peace or war, and her translation would determine which. Safe enough? That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now. Another silence. Longer. Then Serafina's voice came back different. Younger, smaller, the tone she'd used at 14 when their mother died, and the world stopped making sense. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come home. I promise. She ended the call before her sister could hear the lie. Because some promises are made to be kept and some are made to provide comfort, and the distance between those categories is the space where people like Celestia operated, doing what was necessary while pretending it was chosen. She walked back to Dauphine Street through streets that smelled like rain and garbage and the particular sweetness of jasmine that grew in courtyards tourists never saw. Rafe's security detail tracked her from a respectful distance. She let them. Being protected was easier than arguing about whether protection mattered when the real danger would arrive tomorrow in a third-floor dining room where men who believed in loyalty would discover what loyalty cost when someone they trusted had been selling them to competitors for months. Inside the shotgun house, she laid out clothes for tomorrow. Simple dress. Dark. The kind that didn't attract attention but suggested competence. She'd learned the uniform during 4 years at the Opal Room, how to be present without being remembered, how to occupy space without claiming it. Except tomorrow wouldn't be performance. Tomorrow would be warfare conducted through language, and the only weapon she possessed was the ability to hear what liars couldn't hide. She slept 4 hours. Woke at 5, made coffee, read through Isabeau's journal one final time, then burned it page by page in the kitchen sink, watching words dissolve into ash because evidence that could save her could also be used to kill her. The recording remained backed up in the cloud. Insurance. Leverage. The kind of information that only mattered if she survived to use it. Rafe arrived at 8:30. Drove her through morning traffic to Antoine Restaurant, where staff were already preparing for the summit tables arranged in a specific configuration that had been approved by all 7 families, seating assignments negotiated with the delicate precision of diplomats arranging nuclear disarmament talks. The 3rd floor had been cleared. No other reservations, no civilian presence. Just 43 men and Celestia, who technically counted as civilian, but had stopped feeling like one somewhere around day 3 when she'd realized that translating for criminals made you complicit in their crimes, regardless of whether you pulled triggers yourself. The room filled gradually. Each family's delegation arriving with synchronized timing that suggested coordination, which meant someone had been managing schedules to prevent any group from arriving early enough to claim territorial advantage through presence. Dante entered with his 5-man security detail at exactly 10 a.m. took his position 3 chairs from center on the north side of the long table. Celestia sat beside him. Let her face go blank and her posture relax into practiced stillness. Don Salvatore arrived 10 minutes later with the Marchand delegation. His nephew Niccolo moved with the nervous energy of someone who'd been given instructions and feared failing to execute them correctly. Behind them, walking with the careful economy of movement that came from relearning balance after neurological trauma, came Vincenzo Marchand. He took his seat at the table's opposite end, near his brother, far enough from Celestia that ambient noise and distance would make eavesdropping difficult for anyone who didn't possess ears trained by a grandmother who'd used this exact dialect to survive 4 decades of translating for men who killed people who disappointed them. The Houston delegation filed in. 6 men, operational leadership for Louisiana expansion. They'd dressed for negotiation but moved like people who expected violence, the specific alertness that came from knowing shooters were positioned and waiting for signal. The room settled. Coffee appeared. Pastries nobody touched. The preliminary courtesies that preceded actual business. Then Don Salvatore stood. Senior delegate. Traditional opening remarks. He spoke in Italian about legacy and partnership about the future, requiring cooperation about how their fathers and grandfathers had built foundations that this generation had the privilege of maintaining. Standard rhetoric. Expected. Safe. He yielded the floor to Dante, who spoke about operational efficiency and profit sharing and dispute resolution, translating violence into business terminology with the practiced ease of someone who understood that murder was just another line item in quarterly projections. The morning session proceeded through its choreography. Territorial boundaries discussed. Revenue percentages debated. The ordinary commerce of criminal enterprise conducted with the professional courtesy of people who understood that maintaining peace was cheaper than funding war. Celestia tracked the dialect layers, noted when men said one thing in Italian and meant something different in the coded registers they dropped into when they thought translation was unnecessary, built her map, confirmed her understanding of who knew what and who was being deliberately kept ignorant. At noon they broke for lunch. The food was exceptional. Antoine's had been serving this caliber of cuisine since 1840 and saw no reason to compromise standards just because the guests were criminals. Oysters Rockefeller, pompano and papillote, soufflé potatoes that defied physics. Celestia ate without tasting, watched Vincenzo across the table. He was relaxed, confident, a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed. He spoke quietly with Don Salvatore in Siculu Antico, the conversation innocent enough, discussing family matters, mutual acquaintances, the specific nostalgia of men who'd grown old together and believed they understood each other completely. The afternoon session resumed at 1:30. The real negotiation began now. Morning had been theater. Afternoon was when stakes became concrete and positions solidified into terms that would either hold or fracture. 2 hours in, the Houston delegation made their move. Proposed territorial expansion that would give them operational control of shipping routes through Lake Pontchartrain and Port of New Orleans. Framed it as partnership, mutual benefit. The kind of arrangement that sounded reasonable until you realized it meant ceding strategic infrastructure to competitors who'd been planning to take it by force anyway. Don Salvatore objected, politely, firmly. The Marchand family had controlled those routes for 3 generations. Any arrangement would need to preserve that legacy while accommodating Houston's legitimate interests. Dante supported the objection, suggested alternative arrangements that would maintain existing territorial boundaries while creating new profit-sharing structures. The Houston delegation pushed back, harder, the veneer of courtesy thinning like ice in March. Then Vincenzo spoke. He'd been quiet until now, observing, waiting. He stood with the careful deliberation of someone whose body reminded him daily about mortality, addressed the room in Italian. Gentlemen, I've watched these families build prosperity through cooperation for 50 years. My brother speaks wisely about preserving legacy, but legacy that cannot adapt becomes obstacle rather than foundation. He paused, let the words settle, then shifted just fractionally, just enough that Celestia heard it clearly into Siculu Antico. The interior Highland dialect. Speaking to Don Salvatore across the table in what he clearly believed was private conversation, obscured by distance and ambient noise. The time for sentiment has passed. The organization requires younger leadership that understands operational efficiency over family loyalty. What I've arranged with Houston serves everyone's interests except those too old to adapt. Celestia heard both versions. The Italian praising cooperation. The Siculu Antico describing betrayal. Her hands stayed folded. Her face stayed blank. Inside, every nerve fired with the awareness that this was the moment. The confession delivered in a language Vincenzo thought protected him. She translated for the room. Not what he'd said in Italian that had been clear enough. What he'd said in Siculu Antico. My brother speaks wisely about preserving what our fathers built, but I've spent months discussing with Houston how best to honor that legacy by ensuring younger leadership takes control, even if that requires removing those who cannot see the future clearly. The translation hit the room like voltage. Several things happened simultaneously. The old guard dons, the ones who spoke Siculu Antico fluently, who'd heard both Vincenzo's actual words and Celestia's translation, went rigid with the specific stillness that precedes violence. Don Salvatore's face drained to the color of bone. He'd heard what his brother actually said, heard the betrayal in their shared language, heard confession wrapped in dialect that was supposed to be safe. Vincenzo's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to dawning horror as he realized what had just happened, that his private remark had been translated publicly, that his conspiracy had been exposed through the very language he'd trusted to conceal it. The Houston delegation's hands moved toward weapons, not drawn yet, just positioned, waiting for signal or chaos, whichever arrived first. Dante stood, voice calm, cutting through the room's sudden tension with the authority of someone who'd prepared for exactly this contingency. Before anyone moves, before anyone acts, I have evidence. He nodded to Rafe, who produced a tablet, queued up the audio file from Isabeau's cloud storage. Vincenzo's voice filled the room, old certain, describing conspiracy in detail. The Houston coordination, the plan to eliminate both Dante and Don Salvatore, the nephew positioned as puppet, the exact protocol they'd been following. The recording played for 90 seconds. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. When it ended, the silence had texture, had weight, had the particular quality of air when everyone simultaneously understands that violence is inevitable, but nobody wants to be first to commit it. Don Salvatore stood slowly, looked at his brother across the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the specific grief that comes from betrayal by someone you'd loved. How long, Vincenzo? How long have you been selling us to Houston? Vincenzo's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the Houston delegation like they might provide rescue. They looked back with the flat neutrality of people who'd just watched their conspiracy explode and were rapidly recalculating whether salvage was possible or if exit was the only option. Don Salvatore tried again, this time in Siculu Antico. Our father left you in my care, asked me to provide for you in retirement, honor you as family, and you repay this by planning my murder. Vincenzo's composure cracked. He responded in the same dialect, the words tumbling out with the desperate velocity of someone trying to justify the unjustifiable. You were weak, sentimental. The organization needed strength. Leadership that understood the future belongs to those willing to make necessary decisions. I did what our father would have done if he'd lived to see you compromise everything he built. Don Salvatore looked at Dante. Something passed between them. Understanding, permission. The transfer of authority that happens when one generation acknowledges the next must handle what they cannot. Dante addressed the room in English, making sure every delegation understood. The Marchand family has my complete support in however they choose to address this betrayal. The treaty stands. The territorial arrangements we've negotiated this week remain valid. But Vincenzo Marchand no longer speaks for any family represented here. He turned to the Houston delegation. Your operational leadership coordinated with a traitor to destabilize Louisiana families and seize territory through violence disguised as spontaneous conflict. You have one choice. Leave the Gulf Coast entirely. Withdraw all operations by end of month. Or we bring this evidence to federal authorities and let them dismantle your organization while we watch." The Houston men looked at each other, performing calculation, weighing options, realizing that the recording plus testimony from multiple families would bring RICO charges that would end careers and lives with equal efficiency. Their senior delegate stood, "We'll be gone by the 30th. They filed out. 6 men who'd arrived expecting to absorb Louisiana territory, leaving with nothing except the knowledge that their conspiracy had been exposed by a waitress who spoke a dead language better than they understood their own ambitions. The room exhaled. Energy shifted from imminent violence to something that resembled ordinary tension. Men who'd been reaching for weapons returned hands to tables. Security details relaxed fractionally. Don Salvatore looked at his nephew Niccolo, who'd gone pale with the understanding that he'd been used. "You gave the signal. 3 toasts. The old phrase." Niccolo's voice shook. "Uncle Vincenzo taught it to me. Said it was traditional blessing, that it would honor our family's heritage. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what it meant." Don Salvatore studied him. Measured truth versus deception in the way men who'd survived 50 years in this world learned to measure such things. "You'll learn now what it means to be used, what it costs to trust the wrong people. Consider it education." He turned back to Vincenzo. "You have until midnight to leave New Orleans. After that, you're not family. You're not retired. You're nothing. And if you ever return to Louisiana, nobody will need to kill you. You'll simply disappear. The way traitors disappear when families remember what loyalty actually means." Vincenzo stood, looked at his brother with something that might have been regret or might have been anger at getting caught. The distinction didn't matter. He walked toward the door. Nobody stopped him. Nobody helped him. He left the room alone, a man who'd traded 50 years of family for a conspiracy that had collapsed in 90 seconds because he'd underestimated a translator who could hear what he thought was hidden. After he left, the summit continued. Men who'd been seconds from killing each other returned to negotiating profit margins and territorial boundaries with the professional courtesy of people who understood that business was business and personal betrayal was simply another obstacle to overcome. Celestia sat through it all, translated the remaining sessions, heard the lies and the truths and the spaces between where most of the actual communication happened. When the summit concluded at 6 p.m., the treaty had been signed. Peace had been established. The Gulf Coast would remain stable through at least another quarter. She'd prevented massacre using grammar, had survived the exact trap that killed Isabeau, had walked through the door, Odessa's language opened, and emerged on the other side alive. Dante found her afterward. The room had emptied except for his security detail and the restaurant staff beginning cleanup. He held an envelope, thicker than the first one. Final payment. $12,000, as agreed, plus bonus for exceptional performance under circumstances that were significantly more dangerous than I initially disclosed. Celestia took the envelope without opening it. How much bonus? Enough that Serafina can finish her degree without working. Enough that you never have to wait tables again unless you choose to. She looked at him across the empty room where 43 men had nearly killed each other before dialect and evidence had redirected the violence. "What happens now? Now you go home, live your life, forget this week happened, or don't forget, but understand that forgetting is safer." And Vincenzo gets to live with being exiled by his own brother. That's punishment enough. Death would be mercy. This is accountability. Celestia walked toward the exit, paused at the threshold. "Isabeau, she tried to warn you. You didn't listen." "I know. If you'd listened, she'd still be alive." "I know that too." She left Antoine Restaurant carrying more money than she'd held in her entire life, walked through the quarter as evening settled into the particular darkness that comes before the city transforms itself for night. The streets smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, and jazz bleeding from doorways, and the eternal sweetness of beignet sugar that permeated the air around Café du Monde, regardless of hour or season. Isabeau was still dead. Vincenzo's exile didn't undo his betrayal. The Houston families would simply relocate their ambitions to cities where translators couldn't hear conspiracies whispered in languages nobody else remembered. But Serafina's tuition would be paid. The spreadsheet's 31 rows would be solved. The margin for error would return to something that deserved the name. And Celestia Vale would remain alive, which counted as victory, in a world where the alternative arrived with precision wounds and questions nobody bothered asking. She walked to Dauphine Street, unlocked the door, set the envelope on the kitchen table beside Odessa's photograph, the old woman squinting into afternoon light, certain of herself and the doorway she occupied and the language she'd carried across an ocean to give her granddaughter a key to doors most people didn't know existed. Celestia looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she opened the envelope, counted the bills, $17,000 total, exactly as promised. She picked up her phone, opened the banking app, transferred the full tuition payment to Tulane, watched the balance update, watched 4 years of double shifts and careful calculations resolve into a single transaction that meant Serafina could finish her degree without the weight that had been crushing Celestia since their parents died. Her phone buzzed immediately. "Serafina, did you just pay my tuition, all of it?" Celestia typed back. "Told you I had it covered. Focus on your thesis. Make something beautiful." She set the phone down, looked around the shotgun house that had been Odessa's and was now hers and would someday belong to someone else who needed a place to wait until the doors opened. Tomorrow she would figure out what came next, whether to return to the Opal Room or find different work, or use what she'd learned this week to build something new from the language Odessa had given her. But tonight she would sit in the silence that held her shape and understand that she'd survived what Isabeau hadn't, had heard the lies and translated them into truth and walked away alive. She'd been invisible for 4 years, furniture in rooms that didn't deserve the quality of her attention, not anymore. She'd walked through the door that language opened, had become what Odessa always knew she would become, not invisible, not furniture, essential, by choice, on her terms, alive. The city outside continued its eternal work commerce and music, and the particular alchemy that turned violence into history and history into stories nobody could prove but everyone believed. And in a shotgun house on Dauphine Street, a woman who'd saved 43 men from their own conspiracy sat with her grandmother's photograph and the money that proved some promises could be kept even when keeping them required walking into rooms where the wrong translation could have ended with her floating in water that accepted bodies without judgment. She'd survived. That was enough. For now, that was everything.